welcome to our workshop.
And our kitchen. Obviously, Konsoll looks a little bit different this year. We're all virtual. But...
That's right, yes. We're very excited to be here giving this workshop. Obviously, we wish we could be here with you all in person, but very excited that you have signed up. This is Uncovering Your Story, and my name is Molly Maloney.
And my name is Eric Stirpe.
And I am a lead narrative designer at Bad Robot Games. I've been there a little over 2 years. Before that, I was at Telltale Games, where we met.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so both of us were at Telltale about 5 years or so. I'm now a writer at Epic Games. In between Epic and Telltale, I did a bunch of freelancing on things. And I've been at Epic like 3 or 4 months now.
Yeah, working on Fortnite.
Yes.
So this obviously is, we would have preferred to do this workshop with everybody. We're going to try to approximate the vibe and tone of a casual workshop in that we're going to try and kind of talk to each other and wish you were here. We'll be available for Q&A live at the end. If you're watching this recorded, I'm sorry, we will not be live at the end.
But I'm hoping they knew that already.
I'm super excited. So I think what might be best is we'll kind of just explain how the workshop came about, and then so that'll be the first part, a few minutes, and then I will be going through the worksheet, basically explaining the questions, why they're there, how they function, and we'll do kind of a light example game to fill out the worksheet as we go, so that you can kind of fill it out at your own pace in your own time. Does that sound good?
That sounds great. So like Molly said, it's called Uncovering Your Story, and where it sort of came from is, like, with our background at Telltale and everything, most of our talks at Konsoll in the past have been all our talks at Konsoll in the past have been very narrative focused. And we've had some great conversations with folks afterwards where they've sort of said, like, okay, but what if my game doesn't have a story? How do I apply one? Or what if I don't think my game needs a story? And we thought that could be a fun kind of opportunity.
Well, a big thing was, like, especially last year, actually, we got some really wonderful questions about, basically, my game is already partially completed or mostly completed, and I think I would like to add some story elements. And most of the topics that we cover, we usually talk about how critical it is to start with a story and use the story and the gameplay to kind of feed off of each other. But if I'm totally honest with you, that's not always how it works, obviously. In fact, I'd say that's a lot of the work that you did in between Telltale and Epic.
Yeah, and I feel like that's been a really lucky opportunity for both of us. Obviously all your stuff is super NDA'd, but we've both been working on a lot of projects that have forced us to use story in really new ways and in a lot of things outside of just cutscenes and dialogue.
So yeah, we thought it would be useful to actually do a workshop on basically, so you have a game that's in progress, you do want a story, but certain things are going to be locked in now. And how do you create a story that works for what you've already constructed? So that's really the purpose of this workshop, is taking what you have, the game that you're working on, and figuring out what story is going to be right for it. Because weirdly, when your game is in progress or mostly completed, it sort of becomes almost mathematical what kind of narrative will and won't work for you. Based on the gameplay mechanics and the systems that you've got going on. So the whole point of the worksheet here is basically to look at those systems and mechanics and use them to identify what narrative options are open to you and help you get the ball rolling on brainstorming that idea.
And obviously, it shouldn't be thought of as like one size fits all. I feel like there are so many times where it's like, oh, this storytelling, here's how you do it. And this absolutely is not that. This is the kind of list of questions where, when we've worked on projects now, these are the questions that we ask ourselves to find these storytelling opportunities.
Exactly. Like, a lot of this talk actually came from Eric's work, because these are the questions that he would ask developers when he was brought in to help identify stories. Mm-hmm. So, some of the workshop is going to be stuff you already know. That'll be part 1, ideally, and then parts 2 and 3 will be using that stuff that you should already know to identify cool narrative elements.
Yeah, so let's dive right in.
Cool. We have it on our phone
because
we're using our iPad to record, and we don't own a printer.
I promise I'm not down here texting.
Okay. So how about I go through part 1, and then parts 2 and 3 will be more writing focused.
Yeah, sounds great.
All right, so part 1, the whole point of part 1 is to look at the game that you've already started constructing or have constructed, The questions in part 1 should be relatively easy for you to answer. If they're not easy for you to answer, that's good news and bad news. Good news is you can actually start doing the thing where you use the story to inform gameplay and vice versa. The bad news is this worksheet might not be as useful for you. But this is also a great opportunity to start thinking about those things. So we're going to be filling out part 1 with the goal of using all the answers from part 1 to inform part 2. So think about it that way. So 1A, focusing on gameplay, describe your game in 1 to 2 sentences. Now, this is not me asking you to do a narrative pitch. It's not like just come up with a narrative. It is look at specifically what your game is in terms of its gameplay and its systems. So for the purposes, do you have your notebook?
Oh, let me grab that.
Go get it. I'll go live. So for the purposes of this, we have like a little example down below, but we came up with a new example for the workshop so that you'd have 2 different ones to roll with. So you can look at the example that I list below the box, but also we've actually pre-written down kind of a sample game that we'll be using for the talk. So my thoughts were an interesting sample game might be that we're doing a roguelike. Maybe it's got some like platforming elements. It's got dynamic changing dungeons, and maybe there are boss battles or enemy types of some kind. So, I thought like, okay, maybe I'm designing a pretty cool roguelike. I know vaguely what I want the gameplay to be. So what I would write for question 1A would be, my game is a roguelike with dynamic shifting dungeons where I acquire items and take down bosses as I try to descend deeper and deeper into a dungeon. That's totally sufficient. You can go more detailed if you want. If you know, like, all right, I've got a million mechanics and I want to list them all. As long as you know what they are, this is kind of like the elevator pitch in terms of gameplay for your game. And we'll revisit this in a later question to kind of help determine who our character is. 1B, consider your game's target player. What are 3 existing games that you think that they would enjoy?
Something I want to note is, you put a note down here at the bottom that like books and films and TV shows are also applicable. But like the reason we say specifically games is when we're talking, this is what we're going to use to inform our gameplay pillars. And, movies and television shows don't have things like gameplay pillars, and also just there are stories that work for movies and TV and books that don't always work for games, because games are about agency and putting the player in the driver's seat.
That's true. Like there are moments in film and television where it's like your main character is super bored. That usually doesn't work out great in a video game unless you have cutscenes. Oh, we're gonna assume you don't have cutscenes.
but things like books, film, and TV are a great example for this of like tone, for instance. Like you might say, for instance, like, okay, my target player enjoys Legend of Zelda and Mad Men. I don't know what that is exactly.
That's a weird Venn diagram.
But it gives you an idea.
Exists. The point of this question, though, is to really think about the type of player that's going to sit down with your game. Like, who is your target player? And what are other games that you think that person might enjoy? We're actually going to be using these games that you're listing in this section, like finding the things that they have in common. That doesn't mean that you have to list like 3 games that are totally in common. But if your target player likes all 3 of these games, what is the common center piece amongst them that unites that player? Because we're going to use that information as well. So that's 1B.
And so what were you thinking for your roguelike?
Oh, right, I should say. Yeah. So looks like, all right, what did I write down? All right, I wrote down, so for my roguelike, I think that my target player would probably like Below. I think that they would like Moonlighter, and I think that they would like The Binding of Isaac. Obviously, all of them have roguelike elements, more or less. But, there's a lot of interesting things. They're different in a lot of ways, too. So I'll start thinking about that later. But, I think that these 3 games would be really cool.
Which leads nicely into 1C.
What is 1C?
1C is what do the games have in common with your game? And we use that to define those core pillars.
Fair enough. So before I start talking about what they have in common, let's talk about core pillars for a second. Some people are super familiar with core pillars, some people are not. Core pillars are basically the fundamental essence of what your game is. It's distilling your game down into like, what is it that makes it uniquely your game and not another game that exists? Or rather, not even that, as much as if you take away any one of these pillars, your game will stop being your game. Do you want to give any examples?
I mean, like, I think a favorite example that I have is, like, the Fallout franchise. One of their core pillars is 1950s Americana.
Right. Yeah, and that's a good point. Like, the pillar doesn't have to be gameplay. Like, It is, like, the essence of, you think, what makes your game special.
Yeah, and, like, the Monkey Island series is, like, pirate comedy. Would be one of the pillars of that game. And, right. Puzzles.
Absolutely. But your pillars also can be gameplay and often are, and that should be one of them. So it's like thinking about your game as a whole complete picture where it's like, all right, what is like the essence of the thing that I am building? And the reason that pillars are super important is they're the criteria that you're going to, not only for narrative, but literally for everything in your game. Like anytime you start developing new mechanics or systems, you look back at those pillars and you say, is this mechanic serving these pillars? Mm-hmm. If not, maybe I should consider devoting my time somewhere else or scoping the mechanic out. It's really great as a guidepost for developing your game. So what we'll be using the pillars for in this instance are defining the narrative, but you can use them to define a lot of things.
Yeah.
So for the roguelike, what did we put down for our pillars?
So we had roguelike elements.
Roguelike, yeah. A pillar. If you take it away, not a roguelike.
We had in here mysterious worlds.
That is definitely something, like if you look at Binding of Isaac, Moonlighter, and Below, like they're
all worlds you want to get to know.
Binding of Isaac is a pretty disturbing world, but yeah, definitely mysterious.
Yeah. And then exploration was what you had as your last pillar.
That's cool. Yeah, no, I like that. I think that there's a lot of, like, obviously a roguelike, you want to get further and further, so exploration is a super compatible pillar with that. Mm-hmm. Just so you know, you can do more than 3 pillars. I've been on games that have had as many as 5 or even 6. But I think that the more that you refine them down, the reason that I asked for 3, they shouldn't overlap on each other, like they should each be very distinct. And the more you have, the more anything can apply to any pillar. Like if you got 12 pillars, all of a sudden any mechanic probably goes. So try and keep it clean.
Yeah.
All right, 1D. What gameplay verbs do you offer the player? List as many as you can. So this is something that we talk about a lot, but I like to define gameplay often by the thing that the player is doing, aka a verb. Like, so examples of gameplay verbs.
Gameplay verbs include things like running, jumping,
climbing.
Combat, climbing. In something like a visual novel, a gameplay verb would be as simple as making a dialogue choice or tapping on the screen to continue.
Talking, yeah, choosing. Mm-hmm. So basically, any type of combat. You can even get granular with the combat. Maybe we have like ranged combat and close combat, melee combat. But listing out as many of those verbs as you can, like knowing the entire host of abilities that the player has to exert themselves in your game, that's a really useful exercise. I do like to rank them where it's like, okay, yes, you can consume water in this, but is it a really important verb? Like maybe have your high level, like this is the core. Yeah. And then and you can also do these things. What's great about ranking them is what we'll be doing is we'll be using these verbs later to look at our player character. And, ideally the player character we come up with, it'll make sense for him or her to do these things. Yeah. And if they can't, if there are verbs on here that doesn't make sense for that, if they're low-ranking verbs, maybe we can overlook that. And if they're core verbs, then that's less good.
And this is one of the most important questions, like when I've been brought on as a contract writer, this is one of the questions that I will ask the people that I'm working with, because if I'm working on something that's like a visual novel format and they tell me that they want to have some sort of epic final boss battle, I'm like, that's not really compatible. Let's figure out a way to change final boss battle to big dialogue confrontation.
And like a silly example would be like if we come up in section 2 with a pacifist heroine, and then all of a sudden we come back to section 1 and we realize that combat verbs are a big part of the game, then we have a fundamental mismatch. So it's good to use these to kind of go back and forth.
Yeah.
Finally, we've got narrative tools. So what narrative tools does your game have, or could it have, and list as many as you can. So narrative tools are not the same as verbs. Eric, do you want to talk a little bit about?
Yeah, and so again, like a gameplay verb is anything where the player is doing it. Narrative tools are the things that are used to deliver information or exposition to your player. And so in a big AAA game, this would be cutscenes, this would be dialogue.
And I think those are the first things that would jump to people's heads, like those cutscenes and dialogue. But that's not the only thing.
Yeah, and like I've found in my time working on this that like basically any source of text in your game can be a narrative tool. They have things like UI boxes and item descriptions, but you can even get down further and further to like if you're able to do different animations on your player character, if you're able to even change colors of things, that could be a narrative tool.
I'd also say that there, like actual components of your game can be narrative tools. Like when we talk about our roguelike, one of the things that I would list for this is the dynamic shifting dungeons. Obviously, they're not conveying narrative, but the fact that they're in the game is a narrative opportunity. Another aspect would be, for a roguelike, we restart all the time, so probably the staging ground at the beginning is a potential narrative tool. Like, what is it? Why are we there? Like, any place we are going, or like the map, like the dungeon map where it's like you unlock new locations and you have a fog of war, like this is a narrative tool. Like anything really
that can tell you more about the characters
or the world. It's a narrative tool. Yeah. So try and think about this really loose. And, it's okay if you list too many things. You don't have to use all the tools. Like, we're trying to spread the tools on the table. You'd like to use the Apollo 13.
Yes, yeah.
We're throwing everything that we have on the spaceship on the table.
How can we tell this story?
You don't have to use it all, but it's nice to have it written out. Yeah. So that's kind of why that's there. Oh, okay. Are we at the end of section 1?
We're at the end of section 1.
Oh, and then at the end, there's a quick section on identifying your game's pillars. So if you're having trouble with that, feel free to look at that tooltip. So the whole point of everything in section 1 was to clearly define core aspects of our game that ideally you knew already. What's great about like writing them out so specifically is, I don't know about you, but for me, when I'm trying to think about all of these things, it's just like this crazy, like I'm super involved in the game that I'm designing. So it's like this cacophony of voices, like where it's like, oh, there's this and there's this and there's this. So it's like really nice to have it clearly written down. And the reason we've clearly written it down is so that in sections 2 and 3, we can now go back to that clearly written down data and use it to inform the story that we're going to start building. So it's just really nice to have it nice and clean. All right.
Which leads us into part 2, which is where we actually, like Molly said, start taking all this data and
get to the stuff you like.
The stuff I like, which is, okay, now that we've got all the data, how do we actually start telling a story with it?
Yeah, like my favorite thing is the math. I feel like your favorite thing is like,
the pretty colors.
Ideas.
And so the player, and so we get to this first question of like, who is your player character? And I think for a lot of people, like this is something that's one of the very first things they've got. Like, okay, I've done my drawing of who this character is or something like that. But not everyone has that. But I think this is a great opportunity. Molly has this great tip at the bottom here, which is this is where it's useful to take all that data that we've just assembled, like our verbs and our pillars and everything, and sort of say, who's a character that fits with these things?
Yeah, start imagining a cool character. The one thing I would encourage you not to do at this moment is it might be attractive to take all the verbs and like say like, okay, what does this equal? But I also at the same time would say really like step away from the worksheet and think about like what are cool characters? Like is there a character you've always wanted to use? Like think about what excites you, because this person is the protagonist of your video game. Like it should be very exciting for you. And then when you have an idea of somebody who you think would be neat, come back and look at sections 1B and 1A, and like look at like the crossover games that you think that your player would be interested in. Look at the high level pitch of the gameplay and say like, does it make sense for this character to be in this world? And will this player character be enticing to my player?
And so,
I said player so many times.
And so for this game that we're whipping up, where we're talking about a roguelike and exploring, I sat down and I did a little bit of thinking, and I'm always really drawn to like little robot characters. I'm a sucker for a little robot.
Eric loves robots.
And so I immediately said, okay, can we do a little robot? Like, that's kind of cool, the idea of like going and exploring something.
Which is cool because robots are your passion. So it's
Right.
like, I want it to be a robot.
But like the other thing I think is neat about a robot is like I'm obsessed with a roguelike. Like, why is the restart happening? Because roguelikes are all about restarting. And so I like this idea of like, could we have a robot that every time it gets destroyed, you just send a new one? And so like you're literally playing as different robots every time. And so that then, so spoiler, we've done this talk a couple times before.
We've done this talk a couple times in that we've tried to record it a couple of times and failed.
That's another way to put it. But when we've talked about it before, when I pitched this idea of the robots to Molly, she said, oh, does that mean that there's like an operator of these robots?
Well, right. Because like for me, I'm like, okay, you used the word drones the first time
Right.
you mentioned it to me. And I was like, well, I don't know if that works with the worksheet.
But suddenly the idea of having an operator for these drones was really fun because it's like, oh, that's technically the player character.
Yeah, well, and so what I got excited about when you pitched me the idea of doing these little drones is, okay, so I love the metaphor where it's like when I die, the drone is destroyed, a new drone comes. But I also love the fact that like maybe the first time we play, we just start as the drone, and the second time when we restart, we actually the staging ground might be the operator's shed or space pod or like whatever.
Which then becomes a great opportunity for like environmental storytelling.
It's like, wait, why am I in space?
No, and so I think that's really cool. And so we got talking about that, which then led really nicely into the 2B, which is what is the motivation. And so we talked about a bunch of possibilities, and we were like, okay, like exploring some, a weird alien world felt natural.
Right. So, well, the motivation, when we talk about, so 2B, so now that we have an idea of who our player character is, right? Like we're possibly this drone operator and we're sending drones somewhere. The drones die and then we send new drones. Like, that's interesting. And by the way, I think like the things that we mentioned in 2A about character is still applicable here. Like, I think you could give the drones personalities. I think it's kind of sad when they die, but, like maybe each drone is different. Like, I think there are a lot of opportunities that just because they're machines doesn't mean they can't be cute and fun.
Right.
But now that we know this, like, okay, so we've got this person. I really like the idea of them being in a space station, mostly because I love that visual. Like, we go back to the staging ground for the first time and it's in space. And you're just like, I like the mystery, like the narrative mystery. Why is he in space? So what is his motivation and why is he sending these drones to this place? Like, that's part B. Like, now that we have our character, we need to think about what they want. So
my first instinct was doing something like archaeological, like maybe they're looking for an artifact or some sort of secret that's down there. And you brought up the point that that's not like, that it feels like...
It's kind of done.
Yeah, it's done, and it's done in a little flat, and like one of the easiest tricks to make your motivation more interesting is to add a character to it, and then for instance, like Mario saving the princess is more compelling than Mario saving the abstract idea of the regal hierarchy. and so I said, okay, well, what if there was like a person trapped down there? What if there was a person that was lost somewhere inside these ever-shifting caverns?
Well, I like that too, because we might not initially know that that's our motivation. One of the interesting things about a roguelike is because it's such a tried and true genre at this point, like, people get it. If you're playing a roguelike, you're trying to get as far as you can. So already motivation is not really a problem. The narrative motivation could be revealed over time. And I kind of really like that, where it's like, oh, we're looking for a person? Like, this is a search and rescue mission? Like, that felt fresh.
Yeah, because like you imagine the first time that you're down there and you find like, oh, evidence that someone else is down there. And
yeah, like I think like it gives us really nice narrative breadcrumbs. It gives us some good environmental storytelling opportunities. So like that felt really good.
Totally.
So let's go with that.
Yeah. So we're down there looking for somebody. And so that leads us into 2C, which is what is the setting. And I think what's great about this is you talk about characters and motivation. The setting kind of naturally comes out of it. Like you look at how much we've been talking, it immediately became about like, oh, alien world, caverns.
There's a reason that we didn't start with the world, because I like to be character driven. I feel like we've talked about this a lot in the past. Like, I think that the character is way more interesting than the lore. And I think it's very attractive to start with an interesting world, but then you have to shoehorn a character story into that world, and there's like a lot of baggage that comes with that. Just the act of us coming up with the character together kind of started creating a world where it's like, okay, well, drones in space, I'm pretty sure that's, not on Earth. And it's probably not fantasy.
Well, and I think this brings up another really great point, which is like, it can be daunting to do this stuff by yourself. Like sometimes.
Oh yeah, having a buddy is good if you can.
And like, and it,
so break into teams. No.
But like again, I think there's a lot of these things that working, like we've worked on games where some of these questions are unanswered for months. So don't feel bad if you don't have it right away.
Oh, that's a good point. So the other thing I want to urge you don't have to fill out this worksheet in 30 minutes. We're jamming through this, but like ordinarily, this is the kind of thing that we would figure out over the course of days, weeks, sometimes even months if we were on a really big team. So it's okay to like start filling out the worksheet, walk away, take a shower, take a walk, like think about it. Read a book, like get inspired and come back. Like this worksheet exists as kind of like an inspiration. But with that in mind, I think it's safe to say that it could be really cool to set our game on an alien planet. Mm-hmm. I would like it to not be too alien because I don't think we're going to have dialogue. Like we didn't list like talking really as one of our core things. I don't think we'll have cutscenes. I think that environmental storytelling is going to be key, and if everything is super alien, that's going to be hard.
Right, so we want to have things that even if they're alien, we recognize them as what they are.
So let's go for like the Cowboy Bebop version of space, but this is abandoned in some way. And so there are no characters here, but we're looking for this person, and that way we have like human artifacts. Because that feels like it would work. Great. All right. With that in mind, so we've got our protagonist, it's this drone operator with his drones. We've got our motivation. We're finding a lost survivor or a person who's missing in this, abandoned place. And the place itself is an alien world populated by people, probably in the not too distant future. So now let's go to part 3. So part 3 is taking parts 1 and parts 2 and basically using them to cross-check each other to make sure that the cool narrative pitch we just came up with actually works with what we already have in our video game, which is important. Now, the reason I didn't have you do that so completely in part 2 is I think it's important not to be completely constrained. Like, you have to have fun with this. Like, if you just paint by numbers your narrative, it's gonna feel rigid and not interesting.
And so again, not to jump ahead, but I think like a great example of what you're talking about, like this first part is going to be looking at how does your player character and your verbs go together. Where if we set up top, one of the verbs has to be shooting a gun, suddenly now that drone has to be holding a gun, versus if we say...
Yeah, now it's a space marine.
Right, versus if we say one of the verbs is some sort of combat, then it opens up opportunities. Like maybe we find something else that could be doing the combat.
Well, and this is also a good point that I think you've encountered a lot too, which is ideally there is some wiggle room. Like, if your game is at a certain point where you know precisely exactly what the mechanics are, that's okay. That's fine. But if there's a little room where it's like, I really wanted it to be shooting, but it makes more sense if I do this kind of bola thing,
Or bubbles.
If you can still change a little bit, then it benefits both sides. It's not strictly speaking necessary, but I know for you, like you pushed back on, certain partners and they actually got flexible and both sides really were happy. I'm trying to say this in a way that doesn't violate NDAs.
But yes.
We can edit it. We can just bleep it out. Anyway, so part 3, because I'm running out of time. Now that we've got both parts 1 and 2 defined, 3A, how can your player character express your gameplay verbs? So now that we know who our player character is, now let's go back to the verb section and cross-check it. So we've got our drone operator with his drones. What were some of the verbs we used?
The verbs we had were running, jumping, fighting, collecting things, climbing.
Okay. So the one thing that kind of sticks out to me is, like, I was kind of picturing a drone like an iBot from Fallout 3, like a hover drone, and running and jumping and climbing doesn't feel within its purview. Do you have any thoughts?
But yeah, so for something like that, like, so we could either say, okay, maybe we instead change these dungeons so they're all being flown through, Or we could
Wait,
alternatively...
so they're all being... Oh, no, don't do that. That would be a huge change.
Well, so then in that case, then we would say, okay, we keep the hovering, but it's like, it's a hovering where it's only a couple inches above the ground. He just, he does like a little boost hop sort of thing.
Like his sprite animation. So he's not standing on the ground, but he's like just this much above the ground.
Like a land speeder from Star Wars.
That could be cool. I know we didn't earlier define a side scroller, but I was kind of seeing it as a side scroller. So I think that would sell it. Because you could have like a little boost for the jump. I don't think you could climb. So it depends on how critical climbing is. Or maybe I'd have to adapt my hover.
Maybe it goes up the walls or something. I think there's fun opportunities.
I think it could work. And then consumables I think would still work for the drone. Like it wouldn't be food, it would be energy. And I would want to find, maybe you could like Mega Man style find the upgrades. Actually, you could probably use boss battles for that. If the bosses were robots.
They're the last automated system still running in this place. You have to defeat them, and you can take components.
Get the things that allow you to progress.
I think that.
I like that. So, do this kind of exercise with your protagonist. Make sure it makes sense for them to be doing the things. But not only physically, but also emotionally. Like, think about the kind of person, if your protagonist is a human, why they would be doing what they're doing. Make sure that it makes sense. A great example, I feel like, is Nathan Drake, who's like a really nice guy, but then he just murders a million people. We overlook it, but it's incredible. Okay, 3B. What are some tentpole moments in your story, and how can you use your narrative tools to tell them? So tentpole moments are key points in your story where new information is acquired or the situation pivots or changes in some way. There are narrative versions of these in movies, like when Belloc, steals Indiana Jones's treasure and he has to pivot. But there are also in video games gameplay versions of tentpole moments. This would be a boss battle. This would be a locked door, or some kind of change in motivation, like a hub gets destroyed and we can't ever go back there again.
And I think this is to what I was talking about before, where it's like, if you're doing a visual novel, you don't want to have your story have a big fight somewhere in it, because that's just not going to feel super compelling. I think this is a great example of that.
See, manga. Hold my beer.
Well, no, but what I mean is, in a visual novel, if my character's punching and kicking and things, that isn't going to feel compelling to do as a player.
Fair enough. Yeah, you don't want to watch somebody do something. Sorry, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
But yes, no, I think the way to look at it though is you probably already have some of these tentpole moments structured into your game just from a gameplay sense. Now we're looking for narrative wrapping to go over them. Mm-hmm. My cats are fighting in the other room. So this is probably, in my opinion, the most challenging section of the workshop. Sorry, really distracted by my cats. Only because it's like that owl meme where it's like how to draw an owl. Like first draw a circle, then draw another circle, then draw an owl. No problem. Just come up with your tentpole moments. The easiest way to do this is start with the beginning and the end. Every game has a beginning, every game has an end. Visually, how do you want your game to start? You may want your game to start right in the thick of the action. That's fine. Doesn't really have a beginning, but you will eventually have that moment. In our case, when you die for the first time, you go back to the staging ground. That's a tentpole moment. The player will be getting new information at that time. What do I want them to leave that staging ground with? Is it just that there's a human being here and he's in space? Whoa, weird. Okay, cool. The end. Ideally, we're going to find the person we're looking for. And maybe there's a twist of some kind. Cool. That's a tentpole moment. Our first boss battle. Maybe that's where we find out that we're actually looking for a person. Okay. Start looking at the moments that kind of the break points in your game.
And for me, looking at this through the lens of the narrative tools we have, this is great because nothing you're saying to me doesn't sound like a moment that we can't convey with what we've got.
Exactly. Yeah. So, by the way, there's a tooltip here. So this is a formula I use. I'll just blow through it. Character wants, objective, but obstacle gets in the way. You can use this on a grand scale. Drone operator wants to find this missing person, but a series of ever-changing dungeons gets in the way. Or you can use this on a moment to moment. Drone wants to get through door, but slime monster is in the way.
Yeah.
You can use it narratively as well. So feel free to use that. That can actually, if
you're stuck, it's a great way of busting through.
Exactly. If you start high level, you can actually start whittling it down. Like wants to find person, but dungeon gets in the way. Wants to get through dungeon, but boss battle gets in the way. Wants to get through boss battle, but X gets in the way. Like you can keep whittling.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna breathe, even though we're over. Whew. It's so much information to get through, you guys. All right, so 3C. Using the contents of 1A and 2A through C, write a 1 to 2 sentence pitch for your game with a focus on its narrative. Okay. So this is where we combine sections 1A or 1 and 2. So gameplay meets narrative. And this is an elevator pitch that, if you want to think about its goals, it's the kind of pitch that you would give a person who doesn't know much about games. Like, the narrative wrapper is what allows people who don't think about games as game developers do to really understand and anchor themselves in your game. Mm-hmm. If I pitch this game as a roguelike with platforming elements and a dynamic dungeon, my mom is not going to know what that means. But
then I think another point is, if you were to pitch something like that to, say, a publisher, they might say, well, what makes it different from all the other roguelikes with platforming elements?
Exactly.
So it's a handy way of finding how do you convey your game in a way that makes it sound as exciting and interesting to other people as possible.
Right. But if I say that my game is the story of a drone operator trapped in space, using these drones to navigate an ever-changing, mysterious alien world.
To find their lost friend.
Or a loved one. Then all of a sudden, that becomes like way more compelling. Mm-hmm. So you want 1 to 2 sentences. You still want to hit on most of the gameplay core beats. But you also want to make sure you cover those narrative essence that we've come up with.
The je ne sais quoi.
The je ne sais quoi. So it's like, in this case, I think, with all the pieces we've come up with, I see this world as very mysterious because it's changing. Like, why is it changing? Like, maybe it's that Natalie Portman movie sort of thing. Where Annihilation, where maybe the place is very strange, and maybe there's this sense of loss or mystery that's going on, and so fold that vibe into your answer for 3C. Do you want to take a stab at it, or?
I mean, you kind of did it already. Where it's in order to find their lost loved one, a drone operator must send their fleet of robots down into an ever shifting alien labyrinth on an abandoned world below.
Overcoming, monstrous and terrifying obstacles and puzzles. Yeah, no, I think that's the beginning, right? Obviously, I'd sit with this for a little longer than a few minutes to try and figure it out. But basically walking away with something like that, all of a sudden we started with a game where it was like roguelike, platforming elements, dynamic dungeons, and now we have the beginnings of a story. And so it's like, now look at your game that's in progress and see ways if you can fold that story into it, or look at your art assets. Can you use the art assets to reflect this?
How can you make, we can make the art of the drones in a particular way that, maybe tells us more about who the operator is. I think there's a lot of fun opportunities. So
there's a section that's where do you go from here? Feel free to take a look at it, but also we're about to launch into Q&A. So if you have questions about where to go from here, feel free to ask us. We'll try to wear the same clothes.
Yeah, and apologies if any of this we blew through it really quickly. We're trying to get through a lot. But,
we were trying to do it in 30 minutes. We've done it in 38 minutes. So
thank you so much for sticking with us. We can't wait to talk to you more.
All right. Bye.